I was here.
We were lamenting on you certain candidates in interviews. It's really a problem.
It still reduces the holdings, right?
I think we're going to go ahead and begin. 5 of our members are in appropriations right now. So rather than wait till they're all finished with whatever they're doing, we will just let them come on over. There's 4 of us here. We'll start as a subcommittee, and obviously at some point we'll stop and establish our quorum. So with that, the Committee on Accountability and Administrative Review is in session. Today's hearing is on the retirement system investments in Iran for CalPERS and CalSTRS. The camera is not here right now, but I have started a policy in this committee of identifying all cameras that are in the room at any time so that all of my colleagues and the public will know who is in the room. So today we have Channel 13 CBS news camera in the hearing room. In 2007, California passed the Public Divest from Iran Act, requiring the public employees and teachers' retirement systems to divest of investments in companies identified as doing business in Iran if a company met the following tests. Number 1, invested in or engaged in business operations with entities in the defense or nuclear sectors of Iran. Number 2, invested in or engaged in business operations with entities in the development of petroleum or natural gas resources of Iran and is subject to federal sanctions. Those were the 2 criteria that were established in the law that was passed by the legislature in 2007. In the 2 years since, divestments have not occurred. Both CalPERS and CalSTRS maintain they are handcuffed by their fiduciary responsibility to obtain the best return on investment. This despite the fact that in the case of CalSTRS, they have made roughly 7,000 investments, and the number of investments that have Iran implications are less than 25. So it is clear that the possibilities are much, much greater than this small handful of investments. Today we want to find out if there's any new information to be shared with regard to these investments, and we want to get into the process by which we ascertain whether a company is or is not invested in these sectors, is or is not invested in Iran. Today's hearing is specifically about Iran, a country identified by the United States Department of State as a state sponsor of terrorism in 1984. So this isn't something new. It isn't something that we've stumbled upon. The bill that was passed in 2007 was by one of our Republican colleagues, and this is something that has bipartisan support. We want to know how CalPERS and CalSTRS identify holdings that are in violation of California law. We want to know how they track companies when identities and names may change, but not the actual business holdings. More importantly, the committee would like to know what progress is being made on divestment, because it seems as if we have found ways to divest from other countries in the past, and we want to help in any way that we can. I should make clear up front, there are 19 state pension laws for divestment from Iran. There are 19 other states who have similar laws to the one we have, and they have begun the process. Just to close and give some specific examples, New York City's pension fund announced its divestment of a couple of significant investments for them that were valued at $10.8 million. This was just last year. In Florida, that also is divesting from Iran-related investments, the Florida State Board of Administration identified that they were going to sell all of its Siemens stock, which is a company that does business in Iran. Its valued investment was $47 million. So Florida, New York, they are selling their investments in these companies, and I think California should follow suit. So with that, I would like to invite our panelists. We have Ann Sheehan, Executive Director from CalSTRS Governance Unit, Christopher Ailman, Chief Investment Officer for CalSTRS Governance Unit, and Joe Deere and Ann Simpson. Joe is the Chief Investment Officer for CalPERS, and Ann Simpson, the Senior Portfolio Manager, Global Equity at CalPERS. Welcome. And we'll start in the order that I listed, folks. So, okay. Christopher.
Thank you, Assemblyman De La Torre. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of your committee. I'm Christopher Ailman. I'm the Chief Investment Officer for CalSTRS, California Teachers. I was asked to give you a brief update on the size of the fund. We currently sit, obviously this has been a volatile period the last couple of weeks. We currently sit at about $135 billion for the fiscal year. We're up about $17 billion this year, so it's been a good year, and posted about a 17.5% return.
17 billion is year over year.
Correct.
So it's 17 over the losses from last year.
Correct.
Okay.
Specifically on this legislation, we have actually spent a great deal of time and effort. We have traveled internationally to meet face-to-face with many of these companies. And I want to be really specific as it relates to CalSTRS. There were 23 companies identified under the bill in agreement with the sponsor. Of those, we've met with 13, and they have taken action to leave Iran or to cease any future operations in Iran, including Siemens. We traveled directly to Munich, met with them face-to-face. That week, their CEO announced that they were ceasing all future operations in Iran. And we think that was a major significant achievement. CalSTRS has sold stocks. We have sold 7 companies that do business in Iran. That's over $16 billion. That leaves only 3 companies that are currently still under review, and we're trying to meet face-to-face with those companies to be able to engage them. We find it very valuable to talk to companies directly before we just sell. If we sell the stock, somebody else buys it, and the company continues its action. The best way is for us to sit down and meet with a company face-to-face, explain what our concerns are, get them to pay attention to us as shareholders. And as we've demonstrated with many of these companies, we're able to get some traction and get them to refocus their attention, make an announcement or a press announcement, which a lot of is what the sponsors want to see on these bills. And so from our perspective, we've been very active in implementing this law. We have directly sold stocks in following this law and in the Sudan divestment law. And I think importantly, we've engaged with companies, the oil companies that do business there. And obviously, we're part of, with PERS, a whole global effort to get these companies to stop operations in Iran. And we're getting some traction. So of the 23, again, there's only 3 left that we're focusing in on. And we are attempting to actually travel to them to meet with them face-to-face so they understand our issues.
Thank you. We'll hold questions until everybody has spoken.
Okay.
Ann?
Let me, good morning, Mr. De La Torre and the rest of the members. I'm Ann Sheehan, Director of Corporate Governance for CalSTRS. I work for Mr. Ailman, and with me is Phil LaRue from my staff, and it really is our unit that is responsible for overseeing and implementing the legislation that was passed. So let me talk a little bit about add on to what Mr. Ailman said, just in terms of the process, because I know the committee had asked in terms of the process since the legislation was passed. What we do in our shop is when the legislation was passed and signed by the governor, we contracted with RiskMetrics and KLD, which are 2 proxy advisory firms and research firms, to really go out and cull the public information of companies that could potentially meet the requirements under this statute. As Chris said, at that point in time, the sponsors of the legislation had identified 23, and RiskMetrics came back to us with virtually the same list. So then we look at the list across our portfolio, see where the matches are. and then begin to communicate with the companies. We send them letters, find out what their activities are, do they meet the requirements. As Mr. Ailman mentioned, frequently we will go meet with the companies, and Phil and I and Chris have traveled around the world to meet with some of these companies, as well as when the companies come to the United States, they will call us because they know of the interest in this issue. And so depending on what we hear from them, then we make a recommendation as to whether they are no longer doing any operations, ceasing their operations consistent with the statute, but we'll keep them on the monitor list because we don't want them to go back into that country, so we continue to communicate with them. So in addition to the proxy advisory firms, we also search the news reports and other resources that could identify companies that could potentially meet the requirements under this law. Once they come to our attention, and Mr. LaRue from my staff can talk a little bit about how through news reports or other ways that these companies come, we'll shoot off a letter to them. What are you doing? It's come to our attention. You maybe fall under the requirements of this statute. We'd like to know what your activities are. And then we begin that discussion and engagement with them. And so depending on what we hear back from them, then the staff meets and decides, do we need to ratchet up and make a recommendation in terms of are they continuing to operate? Do they meet the requirements of the statute, and what the recommendations would be to the board? As Mr. Ailman said, the 23 were originally identified, but we're constantly adding to the list as new names come to us, and we talk to them about this. We do take this responsibility, the statute, very seriously. We expend the resources of the Teachers Pension Fund to do this work, but our ultimate goal really is to help provide for the retirement of the teachers, and so we do this consistent with our fiduciary obligation carrying out the statute. So let me stop there, and then we can take any questions that you may have. We did provide answers to the questions that the staff had asked us to send to you, and hopefully all the members have that.
Thank you. Yes.
If I could add one additional comment on to Ann's, one of the things you asked about was monitoring. We continue to monitor these companies on a regular basis. Obviously, global risk is an important issue for us to manage as a global investment fund. And so at STRS, we actually have a global risk policy that's up in our board's main investment policy. We have a committee within our investment staff that meets on a regular basis to not only review issues about Iran and Sudan, but obviously issues around the entire globe, all the different places, whether they're political risk, sovereign debt risks, and look at exposure to our portfolio, because we're trying to be proactive to take, you have to take risks to make money in investments, but to look at areas where we want to reduce that risk because we think it exceeds the opportunity set. And so this is part of that ongoing review, looking at these companies. A good example, as you mentioned, Siemens is an example of a company we met with, we continue to meet with, because we want to know what are they doing. They're a very multifaceted firm that's in a lot of businesses, not just the oil and gas or nuclear industry. And so we want to constantly meet and understand what activities. Just last week, over at PERS offices, we both together met with Royal Dutch Shell. Very important company here in the state of California, but obviously a very large international oil firm, to talk about what they're doing in Iran, but also talk about what they're doing in other hotspots around the globe, so we can assess the issues with that company and what kind of a risk it bears to us as shareholders. So this is an ongoing, regular process. We move companies up and down. We don't remove a company from a list altogether, because we're constantly evaluating what's the underlying risk of that entity.
Thank you very much. We're going to take a quick pause to call the roll, because we have a quorum. And around here, that's our fiduciary responsibility.
De la Torre,
Here.
Strickland, Arambula, Berryhill, Block, Buchanan, Caballero, Emerson, Fletcher, Huber,
Here.
Jones, Lowenthal, Perez, Valines.
Thank you. All right. CalPERS.
Mr. Chairman,
Members of the committee, I'm Joe Deere, Chief Investment Officer of CalPERS. I'm joined today by my colleagues Ann Simpson, our Senior Portfolio Manager for Corporate Governance, and Bill McGrew, who's a Portfolio Manager in our Corporate Governance Program. And Ms. Simpson will go into a detailed response to the questions you presented to us. I want to emphasize several things. First, the CalPERS portfolio today stands at about $207 billion. About half of this are in equities, and about 23% are in fixed income securities, and these comprise the holdings which would be subject to the provisions of the Divest from Iran Act. We take this and all statutes passed by the legislature enormously seriously, and we devote and hope to demonstrate to you today considerable effort to comply with the statute. And Ann will go into that, I hope, to whatever degree of detail you'd like. I want to emphasize one other thing, which is foremost in our minds as we do our work is the fiduciary duty we owe to the 1.6 million state and local government employees for whom their retirement security is entrusted to us. That fiduciary duty means we make decisions exclusively in their best interest. And that duty never goes away, and it's never far from my mind in terms of how we do this. We want to, and we share with you, concerns about the state of Iran and its activities and threats to the state of Israel and to peace in the Middle East. We're concerned about our investments in the Middle East and around the world with respect to that. But when it comes to decisions about what action to take for securities in the portfolio, we have to be mindful of risks and costs. And that's what I think this discussion will be about today, and we're very pleased to be here to do that with you. So if I could, I'd like to turn it over to Ann Simpson, and she'll go into detail about how we work on the Act.
Thank you, Joe. I'm joined here by Bill McGrew, who's Portfolio Manager at CalPERS. My name's Ann Simpson, and I'm a Senior Portfolio Manager. What I'd like to do is briefly answer the questions which the committee put to us last week, which I think will give you a good insight into the approach that we're taking, the resources that we're devoting to this issue, and most important of all, what results that we're getting. So your first question was, how does CalPERS identify companies as having direct or relevant ties? We have, although it isn't required by the Act, we've taken on an external research firm, as has our sister fund CalSTRS, RiskMetrics Group, to do the initial identification for CalPERS. We're not relying on our own internal staff and their ability to get hold of this information. They begin with the universe of the non-US domiciled companies in the CalPERS portfolio. And as Joe explained, our portfolio is not only huge, it's extremely global. We're benchmarked internationally with a majority of our holdings outside the US. So this is not an inconsiderable exercise. What the RiskMetrics Group does is use various forms of web crawling, I think is the phrase, web crawling technology to scrutinize both official regulatory filings, which companies have to make overseas, and also through companies which are listed in the US. They have access to SEC materials, but also through the news media and, of course, information that's provided by NGOs. That information is then drawn together into a list of companies where there may be some activity that we haven't yet identified, and that sets the stage for CalPERS, just as CalSTRS does, to write to the company, identify the most senior person, and address our questions to them. Now, the content of that letter is important. We're not simply asking for a confirmation of the information. We set out very clearly what the Iran Act requires, which is that companies demonstrate either that they are exempt because of their humanitarian activity, or that they are taking substantial action to withdraw and wind down their activities. So I want to make quite clear that when this engagement begins, the message to the companies is very clear. We want to see activities in Iran wound down and withdrawn. We are not going through a form-filling exercise. I think that's something we want to emphasize. Your second question was, how deep are the links to business dealings in Iran for a firm using foreign subsidiaries? This is a very good question, because the complexity of corporate holdings and subsidiaries really does pose a challenge when we are tracking connections to Iran. And I want to give you an example of how carefully we look into these complex corporate structures. When there is a subsidiary of a holding company, we take into account not just the separately listed subsidiaries' activities or potential activities in Iran, we also look at what the parent company may or may not be doing. And the example that we've put to you is CNOOC, the China National Offshore Oil Company. We picked that up to scrutinise on our list as a potential concern, not because that company itself directly had activities in Iran, but because its parent company was the Chinese State Petroleum Company, and there were therefore indirect holdings. So I would like to assure the committee that we are not simply looking at the first and easily available level of detail on information. We're actually digging very deep. Your third question follows neatly on from that, which is how are companies and their holdings, contracts and investments tracked? I want to assure you that our contract with Riskmetrics Group is not that they arrive once a year in advance of us producing the legislative report, but that we require monthly updates from them. They have recently taken over another provider, which CalSTRS was using to triangulate as an extra source of information, KLD. Because of the integration of their sources and systems, we're waiting for our 2010 first update. But the contract that we have ensures that we have a monthly update, so we keep on top of developments. Your fourth question was, if a company removes itself from Iran, how do we know they don't go back under different names? Are they still tracked? I think, as we've explained, and CalSTRS takes the same approach, we're not tracking names, we're tracking activities, we're going deeply into documents that are filed with regulators worldwide, but also we are searching through other sources which allow us to tap into the international as well as the local news media and the NGO community. As CalSTRS has explained, once a company has been identified and we've engaged with them and they've started the process of pulling out of Iran, that's not the end of the story. We continue to monitor progress. So at this stage, it's always important to have an element of humility when you're involved in such a large and complex research task. But at this stage, both CalSTRS and CalPERS feel that we are devoting sufficient and significant resources to this to make sure that we don't have companies coming back in under our radar screen. The fifth question, I think very much, Chairman, in the spirit of your question, what's new? You asked us how many companies were identified as subject to the Act initially in 2008, and where are we now? Well, as you know from our legislative report that was filed in the first year the Act came into force, we identified 47 companies. Of course, this isn't the same group as CalSTRS because we have a bigger portfolio and we have more money overseas. So you would naturally expect that although we are taking a very similarly diligent and thorough approach to compliance, you would expect us to have different companies in the portfolio with different funds, with different strategies. We identified 47 companies through the process of engagement and other pressures on these companies. We don't claim that's entirely due to engagement. We know that this environment is volatile and there are huge pressures on these companies, and we as owners are reinforcing those messages. That 47, by the time of our 2009 legislative report a year later, had reduced to 23. Since then, working with CalSTRS, we are now down to, that group of 23 is down to 14, 1-4. And on that list, we have companies like Shell, which, as Chris Ailman and Anne Sheehan have already explained, we are deeply engaged. They are reviewing their position, and we expect to be able to report back to you on next steps before long. I do want to flag, though, that there are a number of companies where we felt, even a year ago, that we were up against a brick wall. However, I'm pleased to say that we've seen movement, and let me give you two examples. One, a state-controlled Brazilian oil company, Petrobras, and please, I hope the company reading these comments will understand they're given with great respect, but we simply assume that state-controlled companies would not be as sensitive to their minority shareholders as the fully liquidly traded companies. But Petrobras took the decision to pull out, and to us, very significant, Lukoil, who Joe met with in person in Paris with Anne Sheehan from CalSTRS at the European headquarters last year. So this is a very significant move to us because it sends a strong signal to the rest of the Russian oil and gas sector. So your sixth question was, what activities does the RiskMetrics Group undertake and what activities does CalPERS undertake? I think from what we've explained, the division of labour is fairly clear. We're using RiskMetrics as a third-party source for information gathering. We have full responsibility for both verifying the information we're provided with, and we do that directly with the companies, and secondly, for the engagement. In other words, for following up with the companies as required by the Act. In other words, we have not outsourced our responsibilities, quite the reverse. We're drawing on external sources in order to strengthen our ability to fulfil what the Act is intended to achieve. I want to give you an example about the level of detail that we're going into. One of the concerns is whether we're capturing everything that's going on. Now, the Act doesn't require, and we haven't introduced some arbitrary level, either percentage or by value. The example that we've given you in our written replies is Danieli & Co. This was a company which was picked up by RiskMetrics simply because they had actually got a customer in Iran. In other words, they had sold a number of their products to that customer. The deal was over. The sale had been made. The company has no continuing activity, but our engagement with Danieli was intended to ensure that they understood we did not want to see any further business being done. I'd like to turn to question 7. What are the costs associated with conforming to the Act, both internal and external? As Joe explained, CalPERS, like CalSTRS, is extremely committed and engaged to fulfilling the requirements of this legislation. The legislation requires that whatever we do is subject to our fiduciary duty. That's actually written into the law, and I'll come back to that in a moment. We've estimated the internal costs as staff time. That's a percentage of Joe's time, my time, Bill McGrew's time, our legal staff, our government affairs staff, and our trading desk. And we've taken a percentage, and in total, we've calculated that the annual cost is $425,000. Now, please appreciate that this is an estimate. It's our best estimate of the staff devoted to compliance, but I think it gives you an indication of how much time and attention this is taking. The external costs are somewhat easier to calculate, and they fall into two areas. The costs of employing the external research firm, RiskMetrics Group, for doing a very thorough job for us, which we think they do, and also because the Act requires that we carry out this activity subject to our fiduciary duty, we have taken on external fiduciary counsel to guide the board's decisions when they receive staff reports. The total of external costs on an annual basis has been $125,000. The third point I want to touch on, which we went to in great detail at the previous hearing, was about the costs, the potential costs of divestment, in other words, selling of shares. What we have done is make sure that when we've gone to the board with the list of companies which are caught by the provisions of the Act, where we are in the midst of engagement, the board must quite properly take a decision to sell those shares, subject to its fiduciary duty. And in order, with a fund of the size of CalPERS, in order to make sure that that fiduciary analysis is done with independent and expert analysis, we've not just relied on staff's calculations. We've gone to Wilshire, our external pension consultants, and the board has required them to actually cost the trades and what that would, which I think the chairman referred to, but also there would be an impact on a portfolio if you exclude a sector of the size of international oil and gas. Now, the good news is when we started this exercise, the number of companies caught in this was a good chunk of the international oil and gas sector. As time has gone by, the number has shrunk. So what we have done is go back to Wilshire at each stage where we've had significant movement with companies to get them to recalculate the amount. And in our written reply, we've given you the most recent calculation, which was just before the end of the year when we went back to the board, at which you'll see the trading costs. And, of course, trades can be from high to low depending on the day and when you make the trades. They range between just under $6 million up to just over $23 million. That was on the trading costs. And the potential impact on risk would give us a positive or negative of 127 million up to a range of 194 million, positive or negative. We did go into all of that in great detail at the last hearing, but we'd be very happy to update you further if that's helpful. Your question number 8, have there been any attempts to inform your members of companies that have holdings in Iran via online or print material? The answer to both questions is yes. Our reports to the legislature, which document the process that we go through, the engagement, the detail of the compliance, is presented to the board in open session, to which members of the scheme and also the public are welcome to attend, and they do attend if any of you have ever been to a CalPERS investment meeting. It's always lively and there are always plenty of people in the room. And we not only provide copies of that in hard copy form, in paper form at the meeting, we also make sure that all of those items from open session are posted in advance on the website. And although there's a huge volume of material that comes out of CalPERS, you know that the board is very committed to making sure that we have as much information available as possible. Finally, your question number 9, do your analysts provide any advice with respect to activities that might aid in encouraging companies to withdraw? The answer to that is yes, but it isn't just our analysts. Involved in this range of activity are the senior and most important members of our investment team. This issue is handled through our senior executive corporate governance working group, which I'm responsible for organising with support from Bill McGrew. That group comprises the following individuals. Our president of the board, Rob Fettner, our chief investment officer, who's here today, Joe Deere, our head of global equity, Eric Baggerson, our general counsel, Peter Mixon, our head of government affairs, Danny Brown, our head of external affairs, Pat Marked, and as needed, we bring in other investment professionals from the CalPERS staff as needed. A very wide range of people are involved in this, but we have a structured way of addressing this issue, which includes the board, the investment office and the other divisions of CalPERS, and that group meets every 2 weeks. So to conclude, the Act requires, and we have quoted the relevant section, the Act requires that our compliance with this Act is consistent with the fiduciary duties that CalPERS has, which are set out in the Constitution. I hope we've demonstrated to you that as an organisation, CalPERS and CalSTRS, we take this issue very seriously. We take compliance as an absolutely fundamental requirement of our role as public servants, but our fundamental duty is fiduciary, and therefore we have proceeded with that uppermost in our minds, and we are able to report to you not only progress at each stage that we've reported on companies withdrawing, we will continue to engage with the remaining group of companies, which is now significantly smaller than it was at the beginning of the process. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to questions, I wanted, thank you for the point by point. I wanted to see if there were any differences in terms of what CalSTRS does in relation to those answers. You don't have to go down the whole list. Just
Yeah. In the global sense, no. The process is virtually the same, as we've said in our questions, in terms of what we go through. Her last point, we have a geopolitical risk committee inside the investment office, which is similar to the one at CalPERS. We do have our fixed income director who sits on that because of the bonds within the portfolio that are affected by this also. And but I would say there are really no differences in terms of what we're doing. We also post our reports just like CalPERS does, make it available to the people who attend our meetings. But in the most part, there's really nothing that differs from what they have done. The number of companies, because of the differences in our portfolio and the holdings, really don't, they can differ from day to day depending on what we hear from each of the folks.
Okay. I'll start off with this question. You mentioned that you engage with these companies directly. In every instance where you both have holdings in a specific company, do you go together? Or is it a case-by-case basis?
No, it's we do meet together when it's convenient for both of us. A lot of the trips are tied. I mean, if somebody happens to be in London, if we can get somebody there, if we're getting somewhere. So we're not always in the same places at the same time. But when we are together, we do try to pool resources and reinforce how important it is to us.
The other thing I would add is when frequently companies will travel to Sacramento to meet with us, and so
Frequently?
we will coordinate those together. Yeah.
I think there was a Sacramento joke in there somewhere. Assemblymember Block.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I want to thank you all for the efforts. It seems like you're making progress, and that's a good thing, a very good thing. Mr. Deere, you referenced Israel's security as being part of the motivation for this bill. And while Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, and we care very much about Israel's security, to me the motivation for this bill is essential United States security. And I'm a beneficiary of CalPERS right now, and I'm very happy that you fulfill your fiduciary responsibility. But as a beneficiary, I'm frankly less concerned about the security of my pension benefits, although I'm concerned about that, than I am about the security of the country. So to the extent you are working in that direction, I applaud you, but I encourage you to work even harder, because companies that provide comfort and support to Iran are companies that are dangerous to us.
Thank you. I'll do that.
I have a series of questions since no one else is jumping in. I mentioned in my opening comments that there are 19 state pension funds that have similar laws as what we have in California, divestiture law. And so they are in the process of getting out of these companies. Isn't that a negative indication for those companies? If you've got 19 pension funds that are bailing out of their investments in these companies, that's going to drop the price. That's going to make those investments less valuable. And yet we're still in them. Either one.
Well, I'll let Chris
Or
go
both.
first.
Okay. Divestment has changed as a tool. A lot of people look back, and it's kind of a long-winded answer to your question. A lot of people look back at divestment of South Africa, which was a global effort, and that's when the capital markets were very focused, where there basically were just there were Western companies involved in that. Nowadays, with the creation of sovereign wealth funds, there are many funds that are actually even bigger than PERS, some cases twice the size of PERS. The global markets are so dynamic. Even with 19 or 20 state funds selling a stock, it doesn't depress the price because the markets are so fluid. Somebody else is picking up those shares. And it's the fact that this is the energy sector and you're dealing with non-U.S. energy companies, so Royal Dutch Shell, Total, the biggest other oil companies outside of our four. There are lots of investors who are eager to get access to the energy sector. And so these markets are fairly fluid. When we've engaged some companies, what we have found out, which to a lot of people is a surprise, is that when somebody sells their stock, they don't really notice unless we actually send them a letter and say we divested because of this. Because again, when somebody's selling, we're not going to just dump the shares on the market to hurt ourselves. We're going to do it on a smooth transition, but somebody else is going to pick up that stock. And that's why we think it's important while we're there to be able to engage, because when we sell the stock, it's like taking our ball and going home. We have no dialogue. That company now has a shareholder who doesn't care what they're doing, and could even make the situation worse, because we agree with your comment. This is a global risk, and we care about that. So the divestment efforts across the United States are having an impact because we're able to dialogue with that. But the actual issue of selling the stock is not materially changing the prices of the stocks at this point. Joe, do you have a different view?
I want to add, and I agree with Chris's description. I think with respect to the other states, it's an opportunity for collaboration. We share information about the companies, which engagement strategies are working. Sometimes we've worked together directly on companies, so uniting our voice to trying to change the company behavior is probably the best opportunity. We have to comply with California law, and that's what guides our action, not the laws of other states. And we're accountable to you for how we do that.
But I would emphasize we do work with the other states, and I think you can relate to this directly. You can imagine if you have in your districts one constituent that speaks up, but then when you suddenly have a chorus, you might get their attention. But then, as Joe said, there are other times where it's better to have 19 or 20 individual hits. And so it's a strategy, and we do coordinate. Philip's been talking this to L.A. County, L.A. City, at great length just to coordinate within the state about what we're doing. So even with smaller funds that don't have the staffs or the ability to engage or travel internationally, we do speak for them when we can.
In your comments, you mentioned that you consider petitions for exclusion on the grounds of humanitarian and other reasons. How many of these petitions have either one of you received over the last 3 years?
We've had several, some of which have been denied. For example, we've had a company which came to us and said, well, we make a lot of charitable donations. We said, well, that doesn't cut it. That's not the issue. We've had a couple of other companies.
Charitable donations in Iran?
In Iran, yeah. So we support women's groups. We're supporting civil society. In other words, we're there giving money to people who are, helping to counterbalance, provide voice to the poor, be part of building the democratic process. Now, worthy as that is, to us that doesn't actually deal with the purpose of the legislation. What we have accepted under the humanitarian exemption in the Act is companies involved with provision of water and sewage to the civilian population. It seems to us that that is obviously a critical humanitarian requirement. So we haven't simply just accepted every request from companies. But Anne,
you guys want to comment?
The Iran law was based largely on the Sudan law, and we saw a lot more of those under the Sudan law. People were providing veterinary care, drilling wells, building schools. More on the humanitarian side is their actual activities is beneficial. For example, the Siemens, when we went there, the follow-up questions we were pulling out of Sudan, well, they also sell a lot of healthcare things, and we don't want to, so that those that aren't the areas that weren't targeted and that are helping the populace is they're staying with some of that. They're fulfilling their contracts, renewing their things on that side.
So in order to trigger compliance with this law, it has to be in nuclear and in oil and gas, right? So are we talking about companies that are investing in those areas and are doing this humanitarian? So I'm investing in the nuclear sector in Iran. I've got some investment. I've got something going on there. But then I dig a well for the populace, and that counters?
No, let me explain. A company will come up on our screen. Let's take Weir, for example. It's an infrastructure company. They come up on the screen because they're in Iran. Our concern is, are you providing infrastructure for the defence, nuclear or oil and gas sector? When we dig in, we find that they are exclusively involved in sanitation, sewage and water for the civilian population, at which point we're happy to put them to one side and say, okay, we'll monitor you, but we don't consider that you're supporting nuclear, oil and gas. You're providing a basic need to the working poor in Iran, and that is not covered by the Act.
Okay, so that's more of a clarification process as opposed to humanitarian.
Well, and that's what the benefit of us engaging with them, to understand what exactly they're doing, and the discussions with them, which you can't always get through the correspondence that we send back and forth.
CalSTRS broke down the investments that they had. 23 companies, 13 were out of Iran, or at least in those sectors. 7 out of 10 had been divested from, and there were 3 to go. What's the current status on the CalPERS side?
Right. We started with 47. At our last legislative report, we were down to 23.
Yes.
And since that was filed with you on January the 1st, we're down to 14. I want to flag,
so
though,
from
that
23 to 14, was that
since
divestment?
January the 1st.
Was that divestment, or was that changes in the company investments?
This is changes in the company's activities in Iran.
So you continue to invest in the 23 companies, just 9 of them have pulled out.
That's correct.
Okay. And the 14 that are left, that's just where you're at. There are 14 companies that are investing currently in those sectors in Iran.
And they include companies like Shell, who we've just discussed. We're we're very actively involved with that group of 14.
Have you had any instances of divestiture?
No. The board took a view initially in February last year when we presented, or it was before Joe and I were on the staff, but staff presented progress to date where companies had been identified, they'd been engaged with, and the board had to take a decision, as the Act requires, consistent with their fiduciary duty on whether to sell those shares. At that point, they took external fiduciary counsel's advice. They also had the costs and potential risks calculated, and they decided in February not to sell those shares. And that was then a decision of the board to continue with engagement in order to ensure that we didn't let the pressure up.
Now, the pressure isn't just coming from these laws that are being passed and these pension investments. It's also coming from the public. And there is a significant pressure coming from the media and outside groups for these companies to pull out. So it's kind of a double-barreled approach. And I accept that, but I think in order for that to work, there has to be pressure on your side that correlates with the public pressure. And I think that was the intent of Assemblymember Anderson's bill, was to have a government pressure to correspond with the public pressure. I think getting back to the details of how you come to these decisions of who is and is not invested in Iran, publicly available, do you engage with the federal government and the State Department in what they're able to find? Because the GAO produced a report, which, if any of the committee members are interested, just in March, to the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs.
Yes.
And there's overlap there with a lot of the companies we're talking about here today.
Yes, we do. We do take those sources very seriously. They're extremely valuable to us. 10 of the companies on the GAO's most recent list are on our current 14 monitoring list.
And we also stay in touch with the State Department, look at the list that they have, and the GAO report. Phil did respond and work with GAO because some companies were identified on their list, that we added and that we're constantly reviewing through our portfolio. But let him discuss some of the activities that we've had with GAO and working with them in terms of what we're doing.
We worked with GAO actually on they're doing a paper that'll come out in the summer on divestment using the Sedan experience. So we responded to that. We did see the GAO report on Iran. We went through all their companies, checked them against our list. It was largely the same, and a lot of companies we don't hold. On our list is a little bit longer. We do have 56 names on our list, but that's because we've listed companies that we think may meet the criteria of the law, but we don't have holdings. And every month we run our portfolio. We check to see if somebody has picked those up. And if they have, we will immediately begin engagement and then assess if it needs to be divested or not.
On the RMG list, they identified 250 companies, I think.
Many of them are in the wrong sectors.
Yeah, and out of that, they identified 60 that fell into the two categories that we care about here in California that have been identified in the law. So that roughly 60, 50-something is kind of the universe that is being monitored on a regular basis by both entities. In terms of changes in status, what kind of proof do they have to show you that they've indeed pulled out, that they've stopped the offending investments?
Well, proof, essentially, evidence. So, for example, let's look at Lukoil. They've taken a $973 million write-off, which is disclosed in their accounts. With Total, we have letters signed by the chairman of the board explaining the position with the contracts. What they're doing there is they're not making their new investments that they had planned to make, and they are simply collecting royalties on their existing contracts. We've accepted that because I think, like Cal Sturz, our view is any money that we don't pick up as shareholders off the table is money that stays for the Iranian government, which would be a perverse outcome indeed. So we go to a level of detail. We're not just looking for a press release.
Thank you. Assemblymember Berryhill.
Yeah, thank you. This is fascinating. I got a couple questions. Number one, we talked about humanitarian aid. Is there, when you give money to any of those types of programs, is there oversight? I mean, is this money actually getting and doing some good there, and can we quantify that? Is there some program that says, you know what, this is actually, they're actually doing it, or is the government not doing it?
We don't make any donations. Do you mean when the companies make donations?
Yeah.
Internally? How is that audited?
Yeah.
To be honest, for us, that doesn't ever crop up because we don't treat that as a reason for being in Iran.
Oh, okay.
I think, I'm sorry, sir, I may have confused it with mentioning Sudan. It has many of the same provisions as the Sudan bill, and in that case, it was different. The operations were generally outside of Darfur if they were looking for oil, and a lot of it, there were provisions of companies that are going in to help the populace that has been affected by the war there. So in that case, we did see oversight. They had to have NGOs overlooking it, or they were giving it to responsible NGOs. We haven't been using that in the Iran case because it's not the same third world, depressed populist situation.
Okay, here's the other thing that just kind of struck me. You mentioned that because this thing's so big that it really doesn't affect this market going up, down, or sideways. So I guess my point is you guys have a responsibility to make the best investments as you can. The fact that you're in this or not really doesn't matter because somebody else is going to pick up these stocks at the end of the day. So I guess it's kind of what's the point of forcing you to do this in the first place? Just any comments there?
Well, sir, as I say, that's why we like engagement. As shareholders, we have a voice, and we can influence them. If you send the shares to other shareholders who don't care, you lose that voice.
But unless this is a global, everybody's going to get out so we can really put the hurt to these guys, this is a kind of an exercise in not much.
I would say that there are actually some major universities who are trying to study divestment in this day and age versus contrasting it with South Africa, which is often cited as the most successful example of divestment. One of the important things...
Was that a global...
That was a global effort in the 1980s, and one of the major considerations is at that point there was only really a Western economy. You did not have the Eastern powers, such as all the Japanese or Chinese companies and Russian companies that could come in. But one of the most effective things in that time era was actually a sports boycott. You had multiple boycotts in multiple areas coming in, not just companies selling. So, you know, it is still a tool that, as we've heard, other states, other countries have used. But I think there's going to be an interesting evaluation of how do you bring about change in this really complex global economy where you've got, you know, if we get a Western company to pull out of the oil and gas sector in Iran, what we're hearing from them is very quickly the Chinese or Russian company is eager to come in. That may actually be more destabilizing for us as a Western power and as an investment portfolio. So it's a very complex issue. That's why I think the comment about the State Department, we really have been trying to lean on the State Department and the UN to be the people that are involved in solving these problems.
It almost has to be that way. I mean, the way that I'm reading this thing, unless you can put a global pressure on these guys, not a lot that we can. I mean, we're not going to, at least any kind of an opinion here. Can we actually, by doing this, can we affect a change of the way that these folks do business, or is this at the end of the day just not that big of a deal and isn't going to do anything?
I was going to say I can't speculate on it. I think there are people who feel very strongly that they can affect a regime change in Iran and that would improve things. I think we've been very clear to the federal government. They have a federal sanctions list. They have not used that for over 5 years, either the past administration or the current administration. This is, as Joe said, this is an enormous geopolitical risk to all of us, including the United States. We absolutely agree with that. A nuclear Iran is not acceptable to us as an investment entity or to us as citizens. But a question of how do you get that outcome is very difficult. And I think best, frankly, from our perspective, we're doing what we can, but it's best solved at the United Nations or at the State Department Foreign Affairs level.
Okay, thank you.
But I would add that it isn't just about one state's pension funds affecting regime change. It is about the desirability of those investments in the first place. Because when you're talking about 7,000 investments, and out of that universe, 23 originally, and what's the universe of investments at CalPERS?
We're effectively invested in the equity of every company in the world that has stock listed on an exchange. That's 9,000, 10,000 companies.
Okay, so 9 to 10,000, 7,000, and you're talking about, 25. So it's about the value here. There's got to be investments that are equivalent to those 25 elsewhere. And so I think that's part of the value judgment as well. It isn't just about, California is going to change the world. No, it's about the value of our dollars being invested in this asset versus that asset that hopefully is equivalent. And that's, we all acknowledge the fiduciary responsibility.
Maybe I can help with that because it's a good point. This is why the board, as required by the Act, conducted a fiduciary analysis, because it's not about the number 25 versus the number 10,000. It's about the economics that are represented in those 25, or as it was in our case, 47, twice that number. So that is the bulk of the international oil and gas sector. So you have to appreciate that you may have 50 stocks almost, but that is going to capture your exposure to international oil and gas. Now, if we're talking about, international spaghetti makers, maybe it becomes down to something trivial, but international oil and gas is economically very significant, and Iran is a very small part of the activities of, say, a company like Royal Dutch Shell or Total. So the whole purpose of the fiduciary analysis was to take an independent, expert, dispassionate look at those numbers and see what the alternatives would be and what the substitution could be and what the impact on trading costs but also on risk of substitution. And that was precisely the question that we put with Wilshire. And you see the numbers that were put to the board, and the board, in good faith, concluded that the fiduciary duty requirement of the Act did not allow them to incur that additional risk.
I would assume now that you're down to 14 that significantly changes, that dynamic changes, because now you're not writing off a whole oil and gas sector. You're down to 14 companies.
Absolutely.
And so I think we would be looking for further progress on being able to get out of certain companies if, in fact, they don't improve their performance with regard to Iran.
No, Chairman, that's exactly right. And Wilshire have now conducted that study for us at 3 separate intervals as the universe changed. And of course, we'll be going back to them precisely to answer that question, because the fiduciary analysis for the board has not been viewed as a one-time.
When do you expect to have that subsequent analysis?
Our next report to the board, Bill, is due. If I can turn to Bill McGrew, our portfolio manager.
The next legislative report update to the board will be in December.
Okay.
That does
so
not
sometime
mean
in the fall.
Sometime in the fall. That doesn't preclude, for example, if a change of events happens with companies, for example, getting out of Iran, that we would not go to the board with that particular update.
Great. Are there any other questions from members? Assemblymember Buchanan.
I just have one comment. To me, this gets down to whether or not you believe in economic sanctions, because in foreign policy you have a whole range of options, from doing nothing to declaring war. And I think if a country believes that economic sanctions are going to be effective, then you not only have to implement that at the national level, but we have to implement that at the state level as well and speak with one voice. So, I don't know if divestiture is going to be as effective today in 2010 as it was, a couple decades ago, but it truly is a statement of our values. And I believe that, economic sanctions can be effective, and that that's a much preferable way to try and affect change than other options. So I think it's important that states act in concert with the federal government, and we speak with one loud voice as Americans.
Yeah. Can I say I absolutely agree with that? And as I think Anne and Philip explained, this is why we have a missing piece, which is sanctions, not just at the US, but also internationally with Europe. That's what's missing in the dynamics.
And I agree with you, except if we all said, okay, I'm not going to do it because everyone else is not going to do it, you'd never begin anywhere. And so, United States is a major player in the world economy. If California were a nation, we'd be the G8, instead of the G7. And so, I think what we're doing is important, and I appreciate the efforts that you're making to comply with the divestiture.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see none of my colleagues raising their hands. I did want to ask, and this we will have some recommendations that we'll be voting on, essentially to better inform the public about where things are at. I know that on an annual basis you send us the report on December 31st, in fact. So that is very good, but I think we could use some consistency in what you do, so that you're both roughly giving us the same kinds of information. That's not at all clear from these reports that we get currently. And I think it would be very helpful if on your website, on the way that you communicate to the general public, that you also, once you've reported to us, that you include that so that the general public can see what we're seeing. Again, you've got members who are paying into your pension funds who are interested in these issues, just like Assemblymember Block. I'm actually a CalPERS member too, from before the legislature, because we don't have pensions. Some of us are very interested in these issues, and we want to make sure, again, that there is a value to our dollars being in investment A or investment B. And so we need to make sure that that's respected for the members who put the money into the fund in the first place. So with that, I'm opening it up to the general public for any comments. Thank you all very much for coming today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Cliff Berg here on behalf of the Jewish Public Affairs Committee, as well as the Simon Wiesenthal Center. I want to thank you and the committee for having this hearing and for drilling down into some of the details of the implementation of Assemblyman Anderson's 221. Also want to say I want to thank Joe Deere, Ann Simpson, and Sheehan and the rest of their staffs for working with us over the last 3 or 4 years since this act passed. And I would say my remarks are not addressed as criticism of them. I think they are working in good faith under the direction of their boards. But I have to say, fundamentally, AB 221 was the Iran Divestment Act. It was not the Iran Engagement Act. AB 221 laid out a clear timeline of implementation in which the boards were required by state law to make determinations as to whether these companies were taking substantial action to get out of Iran and within a timeline divest from those investments. The legislature made a clear public policy decision, which was enacted into law, that divestment and economic sanctions were effective tools that have been used previously, that are being utilized in states across this country. Other states are part of a national and international campaign to put pressure on the Iranian government to stop the development of nuclear weapons. That California was not moving in isolation, that California was being asked to move as part of an international effort to put pressure on the Iranian government through economic sanctions. Because what are the choices other than economic sanctions? None of us want to see Israel or the United States engage in military action against Iran and create a potential for another Gulf War. So economic sanctions were the choice of responsible government leaders, from the President of the United States down through the United Nations, through the United States Congress. When 221 was introduced in the California legislature, CalPERS opposed the bill on the basis that sanctions do not work. Everything that you have heard today reflects the same position they took in opposing 221 when it moved through the legislature, which is that they do not believe sanctions work. So they are choosing to ignore the law. The law says that you need to divest. They are choosing to ignore the law. They have not divested within the timetable the law requires, and fundamentally they rest their hat upon their interpretation of fiduciary duty. The entire issue comes down to how they view fiduciary duty, and they are, in essence, resisting implementation of the law passed by the legislature based upon a legal interpretation of fiduciary duty. What they're doing in engagement, it's great. It's great to talk to people. It's great to keep the pressure up. But the decision was made in law and by policy by this legislature, unanimously signed by the governor, to establish a timetable for engagement and then a timetable for divestment. They are not doing that. They are defying the law, and they sit here today again basically saying, we think the legislature was wrong in choosing divestment as a tool. We think the governor was wrong in choosing divestment as a tool. We think we know better. We think we are right, and we are not going to implement the law. So we applaud you for continuing to keep legislature engaged in an oversight on what they are doing, because frankly they are not implementing the law as it is written. And they will say, well, we're implementing the law because the law allows us to consider fiduciary duty. Well, their interpretation of fiduciary duty very different than The legislature is very different than everybody else's in the world. Florida has divested. They'll say we have a ballot initiative and our law is not the same as Florida. But the reality is fiduciary duty is a legal concept. They have determined through their lawyers what fiduciary duty is, and they have failed to divest. My remarks are slightly different for CalSTRS because CalSTRS has divested of a number of companies. So we see a different implementation of the law between the two agencies. So, I mean, I think we have a fundamental problem in California, which is the legislature has spoken, the governor has spoken, the public has spoken. We have a regime in Iran that is terrorizing its own people, threatening Israel with nuclear weapons, threatening the United States, engaged in terrorism throughout the Middle East. The President, the United Nations, Congress is very concerned about this, and we have a CalPERS that is resisting the law and implementing and being part of that national campaign. So I want to thank you for your continued oversight in this. I think this is a great hearing. Applaud the work of the committee and the staff. Thank you very much, but I think we have to keep the pressure on and get them to comply with the law. Thank you.
Any other public comments? With that, I'll make this closing comment. CalSTRS today told us that they were down to 3 companies that are on the list, and CalPERS told us that they were down to 14. I think we are down to a universe where you can make these kinds of judgments as to whether to continue the constructive engagement or to divest. When you're down to 17 companies, and it's not at all clear that the 3 are not part of the 14, but when you're down to 14 and 3 companies in the universe of 9 to 10,000 or 7,000 holdings, I think those decisions can be made with respect to their fiduciary responsibilities to make sure that there's shareholder value and respecting the value judgment of this legislature, the value judgment of the governor in signing the law, and the value judgment of Californians. And so I think we are at a place now where we can follow through, hopefully by the end of this year, with that report to see where we're at. And if not, then the legislature can, again, double back and do its responsibility, which is one of oversight and making sure that its will is carried out by government agencies. With that, we have 3 recommendations. Number one, and again, these get back to the kind of process and the information that is disseminated. Number one, both CalPERS and CalSTRS should post information publicly to inform their members in the legislature of holdings that violate the Public Divest from Iran Act. Number 2, uniform formats should be developed in consultation between both funds to enable consistent review. Again, more information is better. And number 3, that the reasons for any changes that appear to reduce holdings in companies doing business in Iran should be publicly noted. You testified today that you are constantly engaging with them, that you know that they withdrew from a certain investment, and that's why they're no longer on the list. That should be publicly noted as well, to not to take credit for it, just to identify what it was that they were doing that they're not doing anymore that took them off the list. So again, these are very straightforward, factual recommendations, and would entertain a motion. We have a motion and a second. Okay. Call the roll.
De la Torre.
Aye.
Strickland. Arambula. Berryhill. Block. Buchanan. Caballero. Emerson. Fletcher. Huber. Jones. Lowenthal. Perez. Valines.
We will hold the roll open for another 10, 15 minutes. Again, members are in other committees. We'll give them a chance to get back. Thank you all very much for coming to testify. Thank you for being a part of the hearing today. We will adjourn in a few minutes as soon as people come back. Thank you all very much.